Hello everyone and welcome back to my first prop, the mini-series part 2. Last time we created and unwrapped our crate and barrel model. Today we're going to go on to texturing them inside of Photoshop and Substance Painter, as well as bake ambient occlusions down so we can get that really nice looking diffuse channel. Let's just go ahead and jump right into it. Now let's go into the next step of my workflow for texturing, which is baking ambient occlusions onto our model. I'll start by renaming the cylinder to being barrel done. I can delete this plane. I'll unhide my box and my barrel, and there we go. Their position in the scene doesn't matter anymore. If I want to, I can either keep or get rid of these source objects. I'll just keep them here, it doesn't matter. And now we can do a quick AO bake. And if you don't know what ambient occlusions is, it's where you have ambient light shadows on a prop or just anything in the world. Source Engine does not do real-time ambient occlusions like Unreal Engine or like Rainbow Six Siege or any of the modern engines, in fact. A quick way that you can actually see ambient occlusions in your 3ds Max viewport is if you go to High Quality under this guy right here. Then just go to Lights, add a standard skylight. So this guy right here, just click. And when you do that, everything's going to go bright. Let's hit M to open our material editor. If you don't see this is the slate material editor. To get to the slate material editor, click Modes and then slate material editor. Take a standard from Scanline, just kind of drag it out. Double click on it, select ambient, and we want to set its value to white. And with both of our objects selected, we can just click this, which is assign material to selection, and we'll also check show shaded viewport, which will turn it red. Hit close. And if you don't see the ambient occlusions come in, we can go to high quality per viewport settings, and we can see we have some settings here. I like to set my shadow intensity to 0.8. And then we want this to be material editor setting. And this needs to be on scene light. If we just hit OK, after we leave our camera alone for a second, the quality should improve. You should get some anti-aliasing. You've probably seen this happening while we were actually creating the model. Now we have the shadowing from the skylight, which is essentially just going to be what our ambient occlusions are. If I move this closer to the box and let it improve, you can see that there's shadowing where the objects collide. This is the ambient occlusions. To see how these ambient occlusions would somewhat appear in the world, if we take a box and then just create a box, we want it to have negative height. So our height should go down. And I'll take that same standard material and drag it out onto the box so everything's white. You can hit G to turn off your grid, and it's pretty bright right now, but if we just leave our camera alone for a hot sec, we can see that now where the barrel is touching the ground, same for the box, there's some shadowing there. So that's what we want to get out of our ambient occlusions, which we're going to take this information, bake it down onto a texture, which will allow us to put it into the diffuse channel of our object. To get our shaded view back, we can just go to user defined here, lighting and shadows, and hit default lights. And then we can see our stuff again. If you don't like everything being white, you can go to the display tab and then under shaded, just hit object color and we get these lovely views back. So to quickly bake ambient occlusions, I'm going to put this box on the ground, and this first bake isn't going to work properly with the ground in place because of how I stacked the UVs. The top and the bottom is going to turn out black. Now I'll bake ambient occlusions for this box. I'll select it and then isolate it in the scene so it's by itself. I'll hit O to open what's called the render to texture dialog. And this is what will let us do that bake. We want to make sure network render is off. We'll click this drop down, hit load preset. I have a preset that I will link in the description below. And this is a testing render preset, so it's very low quality, going to be very noisy. As soon as we load it, we'll hit load. Under mapping coordinates, we want use existing channel and channel 1. This is telling it to use the channel 1 of our UVW unwrap If you have automatic channel, it's going to flatten it for you, which will give you an undesirable result. Let's click Add, and then select Ambient Occlusion, MR. The MR stands for mental ray. We want to choose a location. I'll save this to, I'll just create a folder here called bakes, and I'll save this as box test bake AO, and a TGA will be fine. I'll choose 512, and I don't need to change anything else, just hit render. We should get a box that shows up. It's going to show us a very noisy render. And then we can close that, go to shaded material color, and if we go find that object that just got baked, we can look at what it baked. The preview that it gave us isn't accurate. So inside Photoshop here, this is the ambient occlusion information that it actually baked down. So we can see we have shadowing on the inside where there should be shadows just from the ambient world. And if I want to better preview this, it should have automatically applied it. We can see there's some kind of grainy noise going on right here. We can go to default shading and choose flat color. And that's what our AO bake looks like. Now, to show you guys what I meant earlier about stacking UV space when I unwrapped this box, if I unisolate it, and I'll select the box and the ground, and I'm going to isolate everything else. So now I'm going to bake my ambient occlusions like the box is sitting on the ground. I can bring my render to texture back, and just with the box selected again, if I just click render once again, I'll tell it can overwrite. It quickly baked that. If I go to the bake section and let's reload this guy in Photoshop, we can see what happened here. Because this is a stacked UV space with the top and the bottom, we have an issue baking. Your options are to either not bake with the ground like I did here, or we can create a copy of this object and then just bake this one instead with a fixed UV. So if I add another UVW unwrap, and we can just keep adding UVW unwraps, it's fine, and then go to UVW editor. Let's say I don't want it to take in consideration the bottom UV space. So I'll select by element toggle, and that should be the bottom. I can just take this, shrink it down super tiny, super tiny, right there. Like, it does not matter. It's going to be in dead UV space. There's another side here that shares space. Which one is it? It's this one. So I'll tell it to not care about this spot either by just dragging it down into a spot that does not matter. And now I can select that and the ground, isolate it. I'll need to re-add the ambient occlusion MR. I'll need to choose another name, box new bake AO. Set it to 512, and you already have that preset selected. We can just hit render. Now if I drag the new AO bake in, we see that we don't have that issue of it being super dark. Now if I were to apply this to that guy, you can see that this side is super messed up because we essentially destroyed the UVW unwrap of this object. But if I delete that and we actually use the crate that's properly unwrapped, I can drag that new AO bake onto it, and it looks perfect. Now that I know that it bakes all right with this other one that's fixed with this messed up janky UV, right? We're just using it for baking though. I can perform my final bake. I can load my final ambient occlusion bake, and I just want to, I'll do 1024, and I'll set it to 64 samples. Use 64 to 128, and then we will name this as box AO, box final AO. Now this render is going to take a hot sec, to say the least. So we'll just click render and we'll wait for this guy to go. It will take a while. There are other programs that you can use to perform bakes that may be quicker. I prefer to use this method because it produces a result that I like. So I just kind of roll with it. Feel free to explore. This is, again, just my workflow and not a set in stone workflow. Now that we have our box all baked, we can unhide everything in our scene. Select just it and the box. For the ground, we'll place it about right there. So it gets some ground bake in there. Select material color. We'll go to default shading. We can hit 0 to open render to texture. And if it doesn't display right, just resize it and it'll fix it. I'll load my low quality ambient occlusion preset. Use existing UVW unwrap channel. Add ambient occlusion mental ray. Select the size. Choose the location. Save it. And then just hit render. I'll switch to flat color. Isolate just the barrel. And this is our AO bake. You'll notice that the bottom is completely black because we have the box that's there. If we want that to not happen, we can just get rid of the box, or you can pull it away. I'll just get rid of it, and I can do a rebake. We can just select it again and hit go. All right. So now we have some shadowing on the inside here and along the edge of this object. And if we look at the unwrap of the UVW, we can see that there's this black spot here and right here. Now what those are from is from this right here. This black circle is caused from right here because it's stacked, but we can't see that black spot, so it doesn't matter. As long as I have no visible black spots, I'm totally all right with this unwrap. I actually lied about getting rid of that bottom box. I'm going to create that box again. I'll drag it way low, and then I'll bake this guy one more time. I do want some ambient occlusions from the bottom there. Don't be afraid to do some rebakes. We're here to kind of figure out what we want. And if that bottom is still too dark, way too dark, we can always just pull this guy down further and further until we get kind of the result that we want. Select them again, render. And you notice every time that I pull it away, the bottom gets a little bit brighter. And I think this is the result that I want to go with. The bottom isn't pitch black, but it's darker than the top. So now I can select this barrel. I will scroll up to the top, select my final ambient occlusion bake, choose a name, barrel final AO, save, set my samples to 64 to 128, and hit render. Now we can begin the process of texturing our models. We can do this with a couple different programs. I prefer to use Substance Painter. There's also Quixel Suite and Substance Designer, but we can always use Photoshop. I'll texture our box inside of Photoshop since that's relatively simple to show you guys how to do that in case you don't have Substance Painter, and then I'll do the barrel inside of Substance Painter. To begin with the box, what I'll do is I already have our final ambient occlusion bake. I'll open this guy up in Photoshop, and this is where we'll create our texture. Before we start though, I do need the UV map to kind of help me along with what's where. To get my UVW template, I'll just select the prop, go to the Modify tab, open the UV editor, go to Tools, and Render UVW Template. I'll have this texture be a 1024 by 1024, and I'll hit Render. It'll then pop up a new window with our UV template. Just click the Save Image, save it to the desktop, and I'll just save that as a TGA. And we can then bring that guy into Photoshop. If you didn't save it with transparency, you can always double click on the layer and then just change the blackness with this slider here, you can just quickly remove all that. So now I'll uncheck the background layer, and I'll just save this as AO. And I want this to be multiply. Since it's a little difficult to see the white lines from the UV template, I think what I'll do is re-render that, and I'll change the edges to be blue. Render. That kind of contrast is a little hard on our eyes, but we'll be fine. Paste that in here, and then get rid of the blackness. And now we can begin to texture it. A good way to texture inside of Photoshop is to photo source or get source images. There's a few websites that you can use. A good one is textures.com. You will need an account, but they do give you 15 what they call free credits every month. And you can also buy credits here as well. They have a very large library, and we'll just look at some plywood really quick. So we just want to sort of look around and try to find a texture that we like that we can use on our object. I think I've settled on these 3 textures just to keep it simple, and I can kind of hodgepodge the model together out of these. I'll download a few of them, save them on my desktop, and we can start texturing them inside of Photoshop. We can just drag one of these guys in, and my image document is 1024 by 1024. We want to make sure that all of our objects are under our ambient occlusion layer, and the ambient occlusion layer is set to multiply. What this essentially does is put the ambient occlusions on top of our diffuse texture or base color. So you can see how that's just the regular texture, but here's the ambient occlusion information that we baked. All I did was fit this on and it looks terrible, but what I'll do from here is I'll call this box texture and save it as a PSD. We can go into 3ds Max, and then if we apply our PSD onto the model, we can see what it looks like pretty quickly inside of 3ds Max. Certain versions of Photoshop do support 3D. For some reason, it's not working, and my Photoshop keeps telling me OpenGL is disabled, but I think it's just a compatibility issue with my 1080 Ti. So the simple way here to test it is to just bring it into Photoshop, texture it, save the image, and when you refocus Max and then move your viewport, it will update. So the goal for me here is to kind of have the inside be one texture type, and then these borders be kind of a different wood. So I like to have the insides be, I think, a plywood, and then I'll use the borders of this texture here for the borders up there. So I can just kind of hodgepodge together from these plywood images. And this is just pretty basic Photoshop stuff, just aligning edges in the image to the edges on the model to what I think will give a pretty good result. And then I'm going to turn the opacity down on my UVW template. And I will add a clipping mask here to be just the inside of my UV template. Put that there, and then I'll copy this guy. I think I'll flip it up here. And I just need to blend some of this together. I'm just bringing my hardness down. Just kind of blur that. And this texture doesn't quite reach all the way down to the bottom. I'm going to merge these layers. And then with the entire selection, I'll add the clipping mask back. I'll grab my clone stamp. I'll just source from down here and put it up there. Source from about right there. Bring it down right there. It seems all right. I'm missing kind of a top edge there. I can grab. So essentially what I'm doing inside of Photoshop here is I'm just kind of hodgepodging together a material just from source images to do what I want. And I'll copy that clipping mask. And then I will come into here and just start rasterize this layer. It's a smart object. Use the eraser, low hardness, just kind of bring back that old texture. All I wanted this for was that bit at the top. And then we have this little plywood panel right here. If I turn the AO back on, we can see that that actually fits in there pretty well. If I'd like to, I can source a different type of wood for the inside grain here. Let's really quick just see what this looks like inside of the model itself. So it actually doesn't look too bad. The UV map layer was still on, but that's not the end of the world. I think I'm going to change the inside, those little grooves, so that will be something else. In fact, for that, let's just get a plywood texture. All right, download that guy. Put in the wooden textures, and we'll bring that guy in. Plywood right there. Now all I'm going to do is going to add a clipping mask. We'll make a selection that will match these guys. And we'll turn that into our clipping mask. And we can turn that off. So that's a little rough. I think a little bit of softness on the edges here for this plywood would help kind of make this look a little bit more realistic. I'll control click the mask and that will select just the contents. Shift F6 to select feather. I'll just set that to 2. And then I want Control Shift I, and that will invert my selection. If I just hit the delete key, it should kind of soften those edges up a little bit. And it will delete a little bit of the layer itself, but I don't think that's the end of the world, as I'm going to not only desaturate this a little bit, but I'm also going to turn its opacity down. So now it just looks like there's a little bit of roughness inside, instead of it being that harsh kind of plywood. So just a little bit turned up. So the last part for this quadrant, or side, would be these borders here. And I want to use this texture for that, since it literally has the exact thing that I'm looking for, which is this guy right here. So what I'll do is I'll put that approximately right there. And I'm just going to size it up to somewhat fit inside of here. Something like that. Right? And then I can make just make a quick marquee here. Actually, I'll do that with the polygon mode. Just click right there. Boom, 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 boom. Actually, we can add a little bit more right there. And then clipping mask. And that is pretty good. So I'll rasterize the layer so I can edit it. And I want to get rid of these metal bolts down here. We can just doot those away with the clone stamp. Turn that opacity up. It's like those never existed. And the color of this wood is so wrong. So we can go to hue and saturation, and we can just, I think if we desaturate it a little bit, pretty much just desaturating, it's going to get me to where I need to. Then we'll hit OK. That's pretty good. I'll bring that in again, and I just need to do that to the rest of the sides here. So I'm going to do this quickly, and we'll just speed the video up here. And this is all pretty good. What I'll do now is, it does look like kind of a mess up here, but you got to remember, once we turn that UVW template on, this is space that's not even seen. So I'm going to save this, and then we can look at it in 3ds. And that looks all right. Now, normally what you'd want to do at this point is do the rest of the 4 squares. But since I already showed you how to do the 1, I'm just going to copy paste the same texture to all of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to end up changing the grain texture on some of these. I'm not going to completely redo it. So these other 3 were rushed. This one took a little bit of time on to get the edges to look a little nicer. And lastly, we can add one more layer on top. Text layer here. I believe this is the side of the model. Click here and we'll do fragile. That guy into all caps. And fonts up. Rotate it, change its font to stencil. I'll add a clipping mask to it. Put it about right here. Change its opacity. And then hit it with like a grunge brush. And then I will select its edges, Shift F6, Control Shift I after feathering, and then just delete a little bit. And then hit save. Go back to 3ds Max, and there we go. That is our crate, all textured and good to go. Just remember, if you spend more time on the sides, this is objectively the best looking side, because I spent more time on the wood texture itself. Now we can save this image as a TGA, which is the format that we'll end up using when we import it to source. I'll just save it as box texture base color. I'll save it on my desktop for now, and I'll hit save. And that's a quick texture in Photoshop using our UV template. It takes a while. That took about half an hour of fiddling. Probably not half an hour into the video due to editing, but with fiddling, it's about half an hour. Now, the downside to this is I don't have any maps. I'd have to build those all out by hand. This is where Substance Painter will handle a lot of that heavy lifting for us. To get started with Substance Painter, we do have to export our model. I'll select my barrel, go to 3ds Max, export selected. I'll export this to my desktop as barrel export. And when this pops up, smoothing groups, turbo smooth, pretty much default is going to be fine. Hit OK. You may get a pop-up that says that your materials won't be supported in some applications. Just click OK. We're just going to close out of that, and we're done with those. We can now enter Substance Painter. So Substance Painter has a bit of a learning curve to it. Kind of like what I did in part 1 with 3ds Max. We're just going to go through the required steps. There's a ton of resources on the Algorithmic YouTube channel to teach you how to use Substance Painter, as well as their Discord server, and a ton of people in the Source Engine Discord that all use Substance Painter and Designer. One thing I'd like to mention is that Substance Painter uses a PBR, or physical-based rendering, workflow. Source Engine is not a PBR renderer, meaning we're kind of retrofitting Substance Painter to do what we want with pretty good results, but it's not what the program was intended for, so we do have to do a little bit of tweaking to get things right. We'll start by going to File and then New. Under Template, choose Source Engine. I'm going to be using a lot of custom files in Substance Painter. There will be links in the description for all of these. I'll choose Source Engine. Under Mesh, I'll click Select, choose my barrel export. For the document resolution, choose 1024, then hit OK. We should get our mesh in here right away. If you've installed everything correctly, we want to make sure that our shader is on source. It may say outdated, doesn't really matter. If you've used a different template, it's probably going to be on the PBR Metal Rough. Just switch that back to source and you'll get this really gaudy looking reflection. Now what we need to do is perform a few bakes inside Substance Painter. So Substance Painter has the information about the model that we're working on. We can click Bake Textures over here, and we don't want to bake Ambient Occlusions since I baked those earlier. Substance Painter has an Ambient Occlusion baker, which you are totally okay to use. I just don't like how it looks, so I use the 3ds Max baker. The normal baker really doesn't matter. We don't have a high poly mesh to bake down normals into, so it's going to generate nothing. Just click Bake down at the bottom. The texture name is default material because that's what it was named inside of 3ds Max. Doesn't matter, name's completely irrelevant. You may get some errors over here. This is due to the source shader, and if it says baking failed down here, I believe that's from the ID map, since we don't have any IDs on our model. Again, doesn't matter. We now want to import our Ambient Occlusion map into Substance Painter, so I'll get my barrel final AO bake, just drag it on. We'll get the importer. Under the undefined section, click Texture. Import our resources to our project. And let's save the file, save it on my desktop again. And now I want to take this ambient occlusion texture and drag it onto the select ambient occlusion map here. Nothing will really change. Due to the source engine shader, we have to manually add our ambient occlusion to be multiplied on top of our layer stack. We do this with a fill layer, so if we click a little paint bucket with the plus up here, that will add a new layer. And we can see we get some controls over here. So when you added that, the reflections probably tone themselves down. This is the specular control right here. I want to turn off all the channels except for color. And then drag this texture onto where it says base color. And now we have our texture in our 2D view up here, and it's applied to the mesh. If I hit C, I can cycle through my channels. And my base color is just the ambient occlusion bake that was performed. I'll now want to just rename this layer to AO. I'll change its mode from normal to multiply. So now I can start adding information underneath, and the ambient occlusion will be baked down onto my diffuse channel. Since Substance Painter is a paint on the 3D object, and I can show you what that means by if I add a new layer right here, I'll drag that underneath. I can go to my brushes over here. If I choose a color of red, I can just start painting on this prop. If I hit M, I can say, you know what, this red stuff should be not reflective. So now it's not reflective. This red stuff should have height information to it, so it should pop out of the mesh. And if we hit C, we can cycle through all of these channels. Here's my normal channel, my height map channel, my specular channel. And as we paint, we're going to start getting all of this information added automatically to our model by Substance Painter, which is why I prefer Substance Painter's workflow to Photoshop. What I'll do now is just start texturing it. Substance Painter comes with a collection of materials and smart materials automatically that we can use. For instance, if I just drag this machinery smart material out into my layer stack, we can see that it's pretty much done an all right texture for us, like right off the bat. And this is getting all this information from our materials that we baked earlier. Now, I don't really like how this looked, so I'm going to delete that. I'll just do a search for, how about metal? And now I have a result of all the metal materials that I have. Let's go with painted steel. So I'll add a new fill layer and make sure to put that underneath my ambient occlusion. Actually, I can just drag painted steel out. We can see what that's going to look like. There's some parameters down here that will allow us to change the properties of it, such as the paint color. We can make that a bit more blue. We can turn rust up on it. And this rust that it's adding isn't based on anything. It's based on the information that's baked into the substance. So it's not going to really do anything spectacular automatically for us. One thing to know, we do have paint roughness here, and if I drag it up, the model just kind of wigs out in our viewport. That's because Source Engine is not a PBR renderer. The shader does not support roughness maps, so we don't even bother with them. I want to get rid of my UV map here, so I'll hit F2, and that will full screen the 3D view on the barrel. And we can just start to texture our model. These smart materials here will use this intelligent bake information over here. So if I drag steel painted out, we have some kind of wear on the edges of the barrel, which I think this is a good starting point for my model. I can expand this and we can just start changing parameters here. Like I'll change my color to be a blue. This is the base color, which is the metal underneath. If I want that to be a bit more dark, I can do so. And I can hit C to cycle through my channels. So this is the base color channel. And we have a lot of wear going on. We can find where that's controlled by right here. So if we click on our mask, we have a mask editor, which is controlling this. We can scroll down and you can just play with these sliders to get different effects. So you can see when I change the scale, there's a small amount of variance there. what I'm looking for is, so one of these, which is the curvature map, is controlling kind of our edge wear, if you will. And I want to turn this down so there's not as much of it. So there's just a little bit of stuff going on there. So now we can add some rust on top of this. And there's already a rust fine object. We can just drag that out. And we have a few choices. If I right click on this and hit add black mask, that's going to get rid of it. But now I can go to my brushes here and just grab dirt is probably all right. And I can start to paint rust onto this object. And rust isn't really reflective. So we can see that we have the reflection still there on our rust, which I don't want if this rust supports specular map, which it does, but it's a little too intense. So what I can do is drag this guy into a folder, and I can remove that mask and add it here, add a black mask, start to paint on the folder's mask, and inside of the folder I can add one more channel. I'll rename this folder to Rust. I'll turn off everything but specular and height. And I can just drag specular down to nothing. And now this rust won't be reflective. I can use the height slider to kind of have it be built up or taken down. I'll have that have a little bit of indent so it looks like there's some paint wear. And I'll just reset this to a black mask. I can just kind of start to paint some of this information on very lightly. And I can adjust my brush settings over here, flow, opacity, stroke, all that good stuff. The controls for Substance Painter are very similar to most other 3D programs. Hold Alt, middle mouse. And I'm just going to keep kind of jumping around on brushes here. Now that I've showed you how to paint manually this information onto a mask, we can use smart masks to do a lot of this heavy lifting for us. So if we go to smart masks, we can see that we have cavity rust. There's a ton of great stuff already here. So surface rust is probably pretty cool. Let's just drag surface rust onto our folder. And that's kind of rusted up the model for us. Doesn't look that great in my opinion. We can try a different one. How about, there we go. It's a bit better. I think we need to tone down the saturation of our barrel. And maybe actually tone down the saturation of the rust itself. You can go to this mask editor and just start to kind of play around with these settings. So this ambient occlusion slider is using information from our ambient occlusion to add rust. I'll drag that down and can bring the curvature up. And just kind of play around with these to figure out exactly what you like. And I like how this is looking on the side. So I do want to pull it back some. I want to get rid of some of this rust. I want to get rid of most of this rust on the top, actually. So we can right click here and hit add paint. And we can switch to this mode up here, which is polygon fill. And I can hit F3. F1, 2, and 3 will cycle between our view mode. I'll click this UV, which is going to select by UV island. And if I click on the top, it'll get rid of all of the rust inside that UV island. And I'll do the same for these guys here. And I can grab my paintbrush, grab a default soft. And if I alt click on this layer, I can see the mask. And now what I want to do is end up painting away some of this rust. I think it's a bit too rusty. But I like how it looks in the areas that actually have the rust. And this might actually be easier to do in our 2D view. So I can just hold shift and drag across, and we'll start to get this kind of painted away. And that's probably pretty good. Let's take care of this little cap here. This little cap was plastic on the concept art, so we can do a search just for plastic to see what base we have. A dirty plastic. All right, so we'll just drag that smart material out. And we can add a black mask to it. Go to our polygon fill. And we can choose this by element. And if we just click on that guy, might have to go to this view. Select that guy right there. It's the wrong guy. That guy. There we go. And he's right here. So what I can also do is get somewhat of a blending effect. There is we'll grab this brush, and we can use different alphas to kind of paint this information on. So I'll add a paint right here, and this will just allow me to paint onto the mask, right? Add that information. And we can choose between all of these alphas. There was a kind of ring alpha that I just had selected. Actually, it's a coffee cup. This isn't the exact one that I had, but it's not a big deal. Actually, we can use this one. We can just kind of paint around this guy. Kind of get that going. And then if we wanted, we could add a little layer right there. Actually, let's add a fill layer. And we can get a little metal material. This guy will probably work. If we add a black mask to it, we can add like a little circly tab type deal here. Kind of like an air hole or a pour spout or something. And then since this is a fill layer, we can just go over to this and kind of mess with its settings. So I'll change its specular. I can just actually get rid of its specular. Change its color. Be a bit darker. Get rid of its dirt. And then I can change its height position to bring it down or up. Give a little bump out. Remember, that's just on the texture. That's not actually deforming the mesh at all. And we'll come over here and take care of this spout. So this spout had some other stuff going on. I'll create a new folder for it, and we'll call this pour spout. Then inside here, just find metal. Put a rusty guy in there. Add a black mask. Polygon fill. And select these two. I'll add a paint here as well. And I want to add just a little bit of a kind of border around this object here. I'll do that with a regular, just kind of dirty-ish kind of brush. Nothing super fancy. This one might actually work well. Yeah, that'll work fine. Come down here, paint with uniform color, because I'm painting on a mask. I can just click, and if I hold shift, I'm drawing a point-to-point line. Go back and maximize that, and I can start playing with this texture to get what I want out of it. Looking back, the inside was kind of a little silverish metal. It actually appears like the whole top was kind of white painted. So if I wanted to, we can just make the whole top that white. Actually, we'll do that with a different texture in a moment. But the inside here was kind of a bronzed type. There's a bronze armor. Just drag that out. That looks all right. We can add a black mask. Come into our view over here and mask it out. Probably all of this too. That looks all right to me. Come back over here and let's take care of this. Let's just do a search for painted. We'll grab this steel painted, drag it out. That's a little boring. What about tank painted? There we go. That one will work. We can add a black mask. Get the top. We'll also get the bottom as well. Then inside of here, I want to add a fill layer and just turn the reflections down. Then I can change the color, get it a bit more white. We can add dirt on really easily to pretty much any model. If we add a fill layer, make its color a little brown, turn its specular to be none, we can add a black mask and then add a generator. And if we click on this generator, there is a dirt generator. You can see we can just easily add dirt onto this guy. Just a small amount of that detail there. And you can see that it's building up on the inside of these edges here because it's getting this information from these maps over on the side. And we can also add should be a ground dirt that we can drag out. And when we added that, our regular dirt down here isn't really doing anything now. But if we set the new masks to linear dodge, we'll be adding instead of just overwriting. So the ground dirt here, I can turn the level up and down, and we can see that it's coming up from the bottom. Can play with these settings to get what we want. So that's just like there's a little dirt down there. And that all happens pretty automatically for us. So now if we look at our model and we hit C a few times, we'll start to cycle through all of our maps. There's our height map, which we probably won't use. Our specular map, which is going to determine reflectivity of the model inside game. Our glossiness map, which we can also use as an alternative specular map or MV map, but we can also use this as our Phong reflection. This is our normal map, which is going to have these macro details added to it, and then our base color. Now, one last thing that I would like to show you guys that I think is pretty cool about Painter is the physical brushes. So if we go to particles, we can see that there's already some stuff here, liquid stream, heavy leaks. So if I choose this, I'll go to make sure I'm back on base color. I'll add another fill layer here. And of course, I'll add a black mask. And now if I choose heavy leaks and I click and drag on the model, it's going to shoot particles out that are going to represent what would physically happen here. So if I shoot them inside here, they're just kind of going to ball up and then just kind of mess around in there. So with these, I can basically get the appearance that there's water. So after I've found a preset that I like, I'll just go down and I'll turn the global wind up again. So it's like they're being poured out. I'll turn their life up, and the DT will affect how often they essentially draw. Turn the spawn rate down so I get less of them, a little bit of a more controlled effect. If you turn it down too much, they seem to just kind of stop spawning, which is weird. And we can shoot some on the side. Turn the life up more and the randomness down. They kind of bunch up, and we can see this kind of repeating effect where they kind of all converge on this edge. We can kind of help that a little bit if we turn our gravity up and our Z-wind down. It should push them down a little bit more. And then once I have just kind of a mess, it does look like a mess, I'm aware, we can go to our color settings, change this to be a black color. I'll change the specular to be a little bit more specular, like it's oilish. And then lastly, I'll add a generator here, or more like we can add a fill layer, come to our procedurals, and can set this to subtract. So now it's going to remove from our particle mask that we've painted. I can just get this fractal texture, pipe that in there, and it's going to start to remove some of those. I can add a paint on top to also subtract, grab a brush of dirt. Let's kind of get in there a little bit more. Manually refine that. And then when we hit M, we have what looks to be somewhat of a dried up liquid pour out of the barrel. Of course, this is a super quick and relatively messy texture. Just like 3ds Max, there is a ton to learn about Substance Painter, and I highly suggest that you look at Algorithmic's resources. It's super strong software and just makes the whole material process go so much quicker. All in all, this took about the same amount of time to make as the other texture did in Photoshop, but we also get all of these maps automatically generated with it for us. And we can import assets from Photoshop into this to paint stencils on and all that fun jazz. Just look at the Algorithmic resources to learn more about Substance Painter. This is just like what we did with 3ds Max. This is to get you in and out and make your first prop. Let's go ahead and export all the maps now. If we go to File and Export Textures, from the dropdown, there should be a source engine config. Again, a file you'll have to download from in the description below. Let's set its file type from PNG to Targa. Document size of 1024. Let's choose its export location to be on my desktop of barrel export. And then just click select folder and export. It'll tell you the export's finished. We'll hit open folder and we have all of these maps, and these are determined from that source engine export. It's just going to export way more information than you need just in case you want to do manual touch-ups inside of Photoshop. You'll also notice if I open up one of these guys that around the edges of objects, it's bled basically the border pixel out. This is the same effect that you can get when you're texturing in Photoshop by using a Solidify C plugin. It's from, I believe, Flaming Pear. So we have all this information and it's done the padding for us. We can see over on the side, it's like it took the last pixel and just stretched it all the way over. This is for those mapping issues. And that's all that there is to getting in and out of Substance Painter really quick. That's going to wrap up the texturing portion. If you're able to support me on Patreon, please do so. You'll get to see all content, including the rest of this series, early before they release to the public. Next time, we're going to be importing our content from 3ds Max and the maps that we just exported into Source Engine, placing our props in a map, and then we're off to the races. Thanks for watching.